Hey everybody, welcome to the briefing room on this Friday. I'm Devin Dwyer with our Deputy Political Director, Mary Alice Parks. Great to have you with us today. A lot of news to get to today, including some stories that haven't gotten a lot of attention in the spotlight. Mary Alice will be talking to a couple from South Carolina that is filed a lawsuit against the Trump administration over some new waivers that allow foster care associations in South Carolina to discriminate against couples.
Really interesting case. And like you said, some that take us back out into the States where it's really easy to lose sight of how the decisions made here in Washington are impacting people's daily lives.
But the big talk today here in Washington is one of President Trump's most commonly talked about subjects, the topic of immigration. The president starting things off this morning with a tweet, but what is creating so much interest right at this hour is a bombshell new report from the Department of Homeland Security Inspector General about the conditions in the humanitarian crisis playing out right now at the border. I want to bring in our immigration reporter, Quinn Owen, who joins us from Los Angeles and the Los Angeles Bureau. He's been tracking this today. Quinn, this is the latest sign that the administration is struggling to get control of the situation down there. Simply stunning numbers. The headline out of this report is that in one Border Patrol facility near El Paso, they had 900 migrants last week in a facility designed for just over 100.
That's right, Devin. Agents on the border are clearly overwhelmed by the amount of migrants that are crossing, many of them surrendering themselves to border agents. A lot of them are families that are just coming across, sometimes between ports of entry, making an illegal crossing to seek asylum. And at this particular station, the Inspector General found they were several times over capacity, and there were issues with maintaining sanitary conditions. Several of the detainees had soiled their clothes and had limited access to showers.
Well, and these pictures that you're seeing here are from a record arrest of a group of 1,000 migrants this week as well in a separate incident. It's the largest one-day group of migrants ever detained at once.
And the numbers are just huge. I mean, 100,000 apprehensions this month, over 500,000 migrants who've crossed since October. I mean, we can barely wrap our heads around the idea of that many people in U.S. custody in these border towns.
And what's shocking is that this administration has taken such a hard line on illegal immigration. They have troops deployed at the border. We know the president has tried all different sorts of strategies there. But Quinn, before we move on, what is the administration saying about this latest incident, this latest report involving these migrants?
So it's the responsibility of Immigration and Customs Enforcement, that's ICE, to take detainees after they're apprehended along the border. But when they're trying to get transferred from those stations right along the border into long-term detention facilities, the agents at ICE are saying that there's just not enough room to hold people, and those requests for long-term detention are getting denied. So people are kept at facilities that are not meant to hold on to people long-term, and that's when these unsanitary conditions arise.
Oh, really astonishing stuff. Quinn Owen, thank you for shining a spotlight on it and for your reporting. And Mary Alice, it's obviously frustrated President Trump. He was back tweeting overnight. In fact, this surprise has sent the markets in a spiral today. Take a look at the president's tweet. He is so frustrated with the flows coming through Mexico from Central America that he tweeted that he's going to slap on a 5% tariff on all goods across the board coming into the United States from Mexico starting on June 10th, unless Mexico does more to stop illegal immigration. Mary Alice, this is a huge deal. Mexico is our largest trading partner.
Right. The two economies are really intertwined. And it's a controversial move because while the president is trying to have tough policies and use a strong arm with Mexico, tariffs end up as taxes on the consumers back here. So you're basically, in the short term, putting a lot of pressure on U.S. consumers in the hope that in the long term it changes Mexico's behavior.
Most economists say we would shoulder the prices there on everything from cars to tomatoes to avocados to appliances. This isn't going over well today.
And there's a lot of sort of final products that are constructed where pieces actually move across the border multiple times. You can imagine a car where a piece is sort of built here, then moved back to Mexico for an additional piece, moved back here to be put in a final car, or the other way around. These two economies just worked hand in hand, and so much money and goods crosses that border every single day.
And take a look at what the markets have done today in light of this news. They are not taking it well. The markets have been down most of the day today, and it's not just being felt on Wall Street. We're hearing it from people protesting on Main Street. A lot of companies are protesting this. Capitol Hill today, we should say, Mary Alice, even the Republican leader, Mitch McConnell, has spoken out about this. He sort of put a cool statement on it. Joni Ernst, though, and Chuck Grassley, two Republicans from Iowa, of all places, much more explicit.
Right, really freaked out about this idea. You can play sort of a game, who said it, a Republican or a Democrat. It'd be hard to tell. I think that on Capitol Hill, we're seeing real pushback against this White House. We've seen Republicans careful in the past. They don't love criticizing this president, to say the least. But if it starts impacting voters and constituents and consumers in their home states, that might be a breaking point for them.
And as you just said, the biggest sector that would be hit by these tariffs, if they go into effect on June 10th, is the auto sector in the United States. GM, Ford, Chrysler, all of them have big plants down in Mexico. In fact, the GM Silverado, popular vehicle, a truck, is exclusively made there. And for more on the impact that all of this could have on the industry, is someone we've had here on the show before, Kristen Gicek. She's an economist and policy analyst with the Center for Automotive Research, which is the gold standard in the industry in terms of how government policies will impact those jobs and those businesses. Kristen, great to see you. So what's your take on this 5% tariff? What damage would it do to the auto sector?
Well, it would be devastating. You know, the number 1, 3, and 4 products coming from Mexico are vehicles, trucks, and vehicle parts. And, you know, your lead-in is correct. Like, we're not just trading goods with each other, we're building up product together. And, you know, for some of our automakers, they're getting about a quarter of their production is sourced from assembly plants in Mexico. And so this is, you know, going to add a lot of cost. The industry is starting to soften a little. So market demand is softening, and, you know, it's just coming at the wrong time. And I think the other concern that the industry has is, what will this do to the prospects for passing the new NAFTA, the USMCA? That statement of administrative authority was just delivered yesterday, and the House and Senate have to pick up that bill. Canada and Mexico are considering the legislation that they need to pass. But I think this does make it much more difficult for us to see USMCA pass if those tariffs are in place.
Which is interesting, because this president talks about that new NAFTA as if it's a done deal. You said that this latest move might make it more difficult. The White House is saying that the two aren't related, that one is a question of immigration and another is a question of trade. Is that how it's going to be received in Mexico?
Absolutely not. I mean, these are very tied. When you put tariffs on, that's affecting trade. And we've just negotiated a free trade agreement, a new free trade agreement with Canada and Mexico. We had tariffs that were in place beyond the signing of the agreement on steel and aluminum. Those were just removed 2 weeks ago and sort of cleared a big hurdle for members of the House and Senate to vote for the USMCA. Speaker Pelosi is saying she can get to yes for the USMCA passage, but they've just made her job much, much harder. Not only that, we're negotiating with China, with Japan, with the EU. And when they see you can get to an agreement and make compromises and come up with a new trade agreement and still be slapped with tariffs, that does make those conversations much more difficult as well.
And Kristen, before we let you go, I want to ask you about the jobs side of this equation. It's been a really tough year for auto worker jobs in the United States. The automakers have really had to cut back, despite some of the president's toutings to the contrary. And in fact, the president just said today on Twitter, he said that Mexico has taken 30% of the auto industry from the United States to Mexico. He says his tariffs that he's threatening here could actually help drive some of that back. Is there any truth there? Is it true they've taken 30% of the industry? And what's your assessment as to whether tariffs could help bring some of those jobs back here?
I can't get to the 30% number, and the closest we can think is, you know, about 25% of some of our automakers are getting production sourced from plants in Mexico. So, you know, close to 30. But, you know, that has been going on for a long time. We've got automakers. Ford has been continuously producing in Mexico since 1925. So going to Mexico is not a new thing. And it all depends on whether these tariffs are the new normal or whether these are a short-term negotiating tactic to change immigration policies in Mexico. If they're seen as short-term, that's not going to move capital. That's not going to move jobs. That's not going to move supply chains.
Yeah, and we heard from the Mexican president today, AMLO, who put out a statement, didn't suggest he was going to be making any adjustments in the wake of these threats. So we'll have to see how that plays out. Kristen Gichak with the Center for Automotive Research. Thank you so much, Kristen. And it does beg the question, Mary Alice, because the last time we talked to Kristen, the president was threatening to close the border entirely. Right. He backed off that threat. Could he be bluffing here? He created a good bit of buffer. I mean, 10 days.
10 days and not a clear standard. In fact, an entirely vague standard. The statements from the White House said that they would be the ones to determine if Mexico had done enough. That has to be frustrating for the Mexican government to not know what enough is. But you're exactly right. It also might make it easier for this to be a bluff.
So we shall see. A big story headed into the weekend. To some breaking news now on the issue of abortion, which we've talked a lot about here this week. It's been in the headlines. All eyes today have been on Missouri, a state with one abortion clinic functioning. They have been in a dispute Planned Parenthood has with the state health department over some regulations there to certify that single clinic. Today, Planned Parenthood won a restraining order from a federal judge just a few minutes ago to keep that license in place. They will be allowed to continue the procedures there, but Mary Alice, not out of the woods in a state that just has one abortion clinic. It's a sort of a symbol of just how tough things are getting for abortion rights in some of these red states.
Yeah, Missouri has passed other very restrictive laws in the last few months. Those haven't been put in place. Basically, this judge was saying they don't want the courts don't want any new laws or any new regulations to be put in place until there can be a fair process through the courts. The courts will get the final say here. Most likely the Supreme Court will get the final say, as we've been talking a lot on this show.
Much more on the court coming up. But now to a story that hasn't been getting a lot of attention. It also involves a clash between politics and religion in this country. And it's over the foster care system, specifically which families can adopt from privately run foster agencies that receive federal funds. Our Sophie Tatum is our investigative reporter that has been looking into this. And Sophie, an interesting case out of South Carolina that's drawing attention to all this. A same-sex married couple there tried to adopt or foster some children through a state agency. They were denied, and it's all because of the Trump administration's new policy. Tell us about it.
So essentially, you know, Brandy Welch and Eden Rogers have been married for 3 years. They decided that they wanted to try and be foster parents. They go to this foster care provider, Miracle Hill Ministries, and what happens is they say that they were turned away. And it all comes back to this waiver that the Trump administration granted this foster care provider, essentially excluding them from these anti-discrimination rules that were put in place during the Obama administration. And so now they're going back and suing the Trump administration, saying that that's not okay.
So quite simply, just simply put it, prior to the Trump administration, you couldn't discriminate against couples if you received federal funds. But now the Trump administration is slowly starting to roll that back, it seems.
Seems like in this case specifically, yes. But, you know, we're still kind of waiting to see what's going to happen more broadly. But at this place, yes, that's what's happened, is they've gotten this religious protection, essentially. Even though they receive federal funds.
It's having a real impact on a lot of families. We're joined now by Brandy Welch and Eden Rogers from Greenville, South Carolina. It's great to see you both. Thank you for coming on. You guys have filed a lawsuit there with the help of the ACLU and others to challenge this new policy. Tell us about your experience. What was it like? How are you told that you wouldn't qualify with this particular agency?
We had to fill out an application online, and we were rejected via email. That we wouldn't, we're not aligned with their religious standards, or their I guess it's their doctrine is based on traditional Christian values, and that our family doesn't fit into their values.
Had you been foster parents before? Why did you want to be foster parents now?
We've never fostered before. We have 2 daughters of our own already. So we have a family. They're not babies anymore. They're 10 and 7. And we just thought that now that they're a little bit older, now's the time. We've always wanted to foster. So it was never really a question of whether we wanted to or not. It was just a matter of when is the time right for our family. And we recently moved into a place where we had more space, and this is the next chapter. So we went ahead and applied.
A lot of people are surprised at these various barriers to fostering in South Carolina and other states. In fact, we talked to the state Department of Child and Family Services. They've got 4,700 kids in foster care in South Carolina. They need 1,500 new homes. So there is definitely a need for families like yours to take in some of these kids. Here's what Miracle Hill Ministries had to say about all of this. They gave us a statement, and they basically said that their unique ability to partner with Christian parents who share their convictions has helped them greatly increase the pool of foster homes. They're saddened that Ms. Rogers and Ms. Welch are unwilling to foster children if they can't do so with Miracle Hill. They go on to say they'd be honored to work with you if you did share their beliefs, and hope that you can volunteer in other ways. I guess it does beg the question, though, Brandy and Eden, are there other agencies that you could work with instead? Wouldn't it be better off for both of you, for them and for you guys, to be with a group, a facility that wanted to work with you?
There are other agencies that they referred us to. We don't really know what their standards are or what their, rules are as far as who's allowed to and who's not allowed to. We went to Miracle Hill because they're the largest and most advertised foster care agency in our area. There's literally signs along the road on the way to our house and from our house that say foster with Miracle Hill. So that's where we went. We could go to other agencies, but this is the route we chose to go because of the reasons I just stated. And as of right now, we're kind of staying on that path. So we'll see what happens in the future.
Yeah, and finally, before we let you go, what is it that you hope comes of this court case, and what message do you want our viewers to take away from the example that you've put forward here?
What we hope, broad picture, is that that foster agencies, in particular agencies that are receiving funding from the government, would be non-discriminatory. So they would allow anyone that obviously follows all of the standards for being foster care families, regardless of your faith or your denomination of your church or your sexual orientation, as long as you can provide a stable home and follow all the guidelines for foster care that anybody could foster. And more privately, our goal in the end of this is to be foster parents, to be able to open our homes for whatever time we're needed and provide unconditional love to kids.
Well, we hope you get there, because there certainly are so many kids in your state and all across the country that need good parents and a lot of love. Brandy Welch and Eden Rogers, thank you so much for sharing your story and taking the time to come on with us today.
Thank you.
And Sophie, this, just as we wrap this up, we were saying before the show, this is much bigger than South Carolina.
Yeah,
in fact, there are other states that are looking to roll back those protections.
That's correct. So before this lawsuit was filed yesterday, actually, a couple months ago, the Texas Attorney General asked the Trump administration to completely repeal this Obama-era rule, this anti-discrimination rule. And so what we're reporting is that the administration is currently weighing that request.
Oh.
So
I've done a lot of healthcare reporting, and I've heard from many states and local governments that the opioid epidemic has really increased the need for foster care and foster families across the country. Like you said, there's often more kids looking for homes, which just kind of adds fuel to this fire.
Thanks for putting a spotlight on it. It's an important case that I know you'll be following. Sophie Tatum, thank you so much. Moving on now to a big story out of the Supreme Court that's coming up. We're in decision time here in June as the Supreme Court prepares to release its final opinions of the year. We have, I think, something like a handful left every Monday.
Oh, come on, you don't know? You've been checking them all.
Well, there are dozens of cases in the pipeline, a handful of the big ones that we want to know. One of those is the case of a World War I memorial, a cross, a 40-ton, 16-foot marble cross up in Maryland. You've been there, Mary Alice. You know about this. This is a cross that has drawn so much scrutiny because it's smack dab in the middle of a road.
And because, like any symbol, what it represents. And for people that don't want it there, it represents the federal government sort of proselytizing, endorsing a big religious monument. There are others that say it's exciting, it's historic, it's beautiful.
It's been there
for a long time. And I was struck by some of the arguments in the last few days. People that talk really emotionally about it being a slippery slope. About what about a cross that's on a gravestone that's in a federal graveyard? So you can imagine how heated this conversation has become.
And as this case comes to a head, the decision due any day now could come down on Monday. Our Janet Weinstein traveled up to Bladensburg, Maryland to meet people on both sides of the cross, an American veteran and American humanist who had some pretty compelling arguments on both sides. Take a listen.
This was actually erected on American Legion property initially, and it stood there without a problem until the highway had to be expanded. And when the highway had to be expanded, they took the property, the state did, from the American Legion, and thought at that time perhaps of removing it. But there was such a cry in this community at that thought that they built the highway around it and left it standing in the median.
If you drive by, it's not at all immediately apparent that it's a memorial. It just looks like a giant cross. You have to actually get out of your car, park, go across the busy intersection before you realize that it's a memorial to veterans.
I have a personal stake in the cross. When I was 13 years old, my father took me to Peace Cross and said, "Son, I want you to look at this cross. This represents what the people of this county think about sacrifice and service of the men who died here."
Obviously, the fact that it's a 40-foot tall giant Latin cross to me makes it seem like religion is being condoned by the government of Bladensburg and the state of Maryland. And being non-religious and being a person who doesn't believe in a God and is not Christian, I find that frustrating and confusing and makes me feel like I'm outside of the mainstream of what our country is.
My grandmother, Pearl Fenwick, was one of the Gold Star mothers who worked with the American Legion to have the cross erected. They picked the cross because in France, where the men were buried originally, they were buried under white crosses. That cross goes. It's the same as like desecrating something from a cemetery. That's exactly how I feel.
But the cross was put up by a private organization when it was put up. And that private organization made decisions to exclude other religions from their memorial. But as a private organization, they had the right to do that. Now it has been maintained and bought and taken care of by the state of Maryland. And so that private organization and that private memorial is no longer private, it is public.
Because it's in a median, it can't have private property in the highway median. It's against the law, and so it has to be on public property.
It is eroding that wall of separation between church and state. And so we don't want the memorial to be destroyed. We want it either removed and put up somewhere else, or we want the land under it to be transferred to somebody else.
I hope that the Supreme Court comes up with a much clearer definition of the separation of church and state.
And we'll see if the Supreme Court comes up with a clearer definition. As we've been reporting, Mary Alice, they for years have fumbled this one. It is a murky area of law, very inconsistent standard. And when I was in that courtroom for the oral arguments over this cross, you didn't get any indication they were going to create some new standard. But I do think that cross will probably end up standing. We shall see.
Yeah, it's really interesting.
Fascinating case. We end today with a moving national tribute playing out this afternoon on the National Mall. A tribute to survivors of sexual violence in this country. It's on display. It's called the Monument Quilt. It's a patchwork of stories and survivor tales, more than 3,000 of them, and a powerful symbol to what so many women have endured. And our Serena Marshall is out there on the National Mall, has been studying the quilt today. Serena, give us your impressions. Tell us about it and some of the folks you've been talking to.
Devin, Mary Alice, this is really something to behold. Like you said, 3,000 quilts, 4 football fields long. It goes from the Washington Monument all the way down to the Capitol. It spells out "Not Alone," No Estás Solex in Spanish. Each quilt made by one or multiple survivors, supporters, victims of sexual assault, and each one so unique and so different. Some of them are very simple, simply saying you're not alone. Others have letters that they've written to themselves, to their family members, and in some cases to their accused rapist, and are joined here actually by one woman who created one of these and worked with victims of sexual assault. Lorena, tell us, why quilts?
The quilts offer the space to heal for survivors that sometimes it's the first time they are telling their own story to somebody else because they have been keeping it inside as a secret. They feel ashamed, and quilts offer the space to feel that they are not alone. And
you're a social worker. You've been doing this for quite some time. You told me earlier about the transformation you've seen some people do as they went through this process.
Breaking the silence is powerful, and that's what they are doing with the quilts. For first time telling their stories and putting it out and feeling that the trauma they survive is not their fault, but it's another person who put them in that situation, is really changing their lives.
And you helped some survivors make some of these quilts. Let's take a look. This is the one that you, here, separate over here.
This is the one I made, or those are some of the quilts. That one was made for one little girl that was 4 years old, who was helping her mother doing their quilt. And it says, "Stop that, don't be mean." That's a survivor of domestic violence. Yeah. And there are many others, many more quilts. We made another for Marisa Alexander, who's going to be here tomorrow, who was in prison for 60 years and now is out and is going to be helping us because we are also demanding spaces to heal for survivors here in D.C., where there are many monuments, but not even one for survivors of gender-based violence.
And you have this on the National Mall in front of the Capitol. You want members of Congress to come out here, read these, and listen. Why is listening so important?
Because the survivors know what do they need. They know what changes in law has to be made to support them, because right now it's difficult to come up with their own story or just go to the police and report what has happened. It's been really difficult, and survivors have to go through different trauma more than the one they experienced before.
And if there's one message you want people to take away?
I want all the survivors to know that they are not alone, that there are a group of people working, supporting them, and we want to change the narrative, supporting survivors instead of blaming them.
Thank you, Lorena, and thank you for joining us out here, Devin, Mary Alice. It's quite amazing. If you can't come down to the National Mall this weekend, where I was told you expect up to 100,000 visitors, they are going to be taking these quilts out into different communities throughout the next couple of weeks.
Serena, thanks so much. The weather looks beautiful for it this weekend as well. Neat tribute.
Yeah, she said, breaking the silence is powerful. I couldn't agree more. That's a really incredible way to do that.
And before we go today, wrap up this busy week, looking ahead to this weekend, a lot happening out on the campaign trail for 2020.
Right. Should we sing? I've been having that song stuck in my head. Oh, the song that's California.
From the OC?
From the OC.
All right, we're getting the rap.
There are more presidential candidates headed to California than we've seen all together in a long time, and they're going to be in San Francisco this weekend. We have a lot of political reporters that will be there following that.
Covering that live right here on ABC News Live. Full team coverage. We'll wrap it up on Monday right here in the briefing room, 3:30 Eastern Time. Great to have Mary Alice Parks as always. I'm Devin Dwyer. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you on Monday.